Hi everyone, my name is Melissa van Dijk, and in today's video I want to talk about the relationship between sugar and acne breakouts and what didn't really add up for me. Because over the last 2 years of tracking my skin very carefully, I started noticing something that didn't fully make sense. There were periods where my sugar intake was actually relatively high, especially from things like homemade cakes or cookies, but also from food. And my skin still stayed surprisingly calm. But then there were other periods where my skin became much more reactive, even when my sugar intake wasn't really that different. And one thing that kept showing up during those periods was water retention, especially before my period. And the more I paid attention to it, the more I started wondering, why are we always talking about sugar and hormones, but barely ever talk about fluid retention, sodium or mineral balance? Because if your body is visibly retaining water, then something is clearly changing physically. It's not just something random happening on the surface of the skin. And I think this becomes even more noticeable as a woman, because the body naturally shifts so much throughout the cycle. So instead of just blaming hormones, I started thinking, okay, but why are they reacting like that? And honestly, that changed the way I started looking at food. Because humans have always consumed sugar in some form. Fruit, honey, dates, potatoes, rice, and even homemade sweet foods. So it's not like the body has no idea what to do with glucose. We have insulin, we have glycogen storage in the liver and muscles, and we have ways to use glucose as energy. So to me, sugar by itself didn't seem like this completely foreign thing the body was helpless against. But what's much newer is the way food is made today, especially when it comes to sodium. And once I started paying more attention to that, I realized how aggressively salted modern foods actually are. I mean, if you look at things like packaged fish, dairy products, sauces, processed meats, snacks, a lot of them contain surprisingly high amounts of sodium, added salts, or other mineral additives. And I think what's most confusing is that many of these foods still look simple or healthy, but in practice they're often very different from basic fresh foods. And if I really think about it, it's kind of strange how little attention this gets compared to sugar. But industry-wise, it makes sense. Because modern processed food systems can function without sugar. They can replace sugar with sweeteners. They can market low-carb versions of things. But salt is different. Salt is built into processed food in a completely different way. It affects preservation, texture, water retention, taste. So then I started wondering, what happens when that hidden sodium keeps showing up in the diet, especially at times when the body is already more likely to hold on to water? And honestly, once I started noticing that, I began looking at the whole hormonal acne conversation differently. Because maybe part of what people describe as hormonal is actually the body reacting to an environment that is already inflamed, swollen, or overloaded, especially during phases of the cycle where the body naturally becomes more sensitive to fluid shifts. So then it's not just all my hormones randomly caused a breakout. It's more like my body was already in a more reactive state, and then the hormonal shift pushed it over the edge. And to me, that makes way more sense. Because if I was already retaining water, if my body felt heavier, if my digestion felt slower, then the breakout didn't feel like something completely random anymore. It felt like part of a bigger pattern. And so the solution wasn't really to obsess over one single thing, but to stop my body from getting into that overloaded water-retaining reactive state in the first place. And for me, that seems to come back to simple whole foods, less processed foods, less heavily altered foods, and just paying very close attention to patterns over time. And if I really think about it, I also think this is one of the reasons why these conversations become so complicated online. because simplicity is difficult to build an industry around. There's not much to sell if the answer is mostly eat simpler foods, pay attention to patterns, and stop constantly overwhelming your body. That's not a very marketable message. You can't really brand that. You can't trademark like boiled potatoes, fresh fish, plain rice, fruit, or homemade food. But you can build an entire product around a low-carb snack, a protein bar, a sugar-free dessert, a supplement, or some kind of skin-clearing system. And I think that's why so many people end up trapped in this endless cycle of searching for a specific villain. Instead of looking at the overall environment they're creating internally. Now obviously, this is just my own experience and observations from tracking everything very closely over a long period of time. But I have to say, I did not miss a single day over the last 2 years. And it's very obvious to me. So personally, I think we may be oversimplifying acne by reducing it to hormones and sugar, while ignoring the actual state, the tissue itself. Especially things like sodium and water retention. Now, if you have any thoughts on this, feel free to leave them in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!